working? Can you hear me? We're videotaping this, so we're just making sure that we're ready to go with the videotape. We're all set. So, first of all, thank you all for coming. Certainly appreciate the turnout we've got today, and I think you're going to be quite excited with the speaker we have. It's quite an interesting topic. I should introduce myself first. I'm Doug Mullally, President of the Bruce Power Pensioners. I really want to thank Meridian for putting this on for us. We did this about 5 years ago, so we thought it was time for an update. And we were lucky enough last time to have Doug Carroll do the presentation. And once you hear Doug again this time, for those of you that are new, he does just an excellent presentation. It's down to earth. Even I can understand it, so it's quite good. So again, I want to thank Meridian folks. I'm looking around for Jason Shear. He's over here. Jason's an investment advisor with Meridian, and he was sort of spearheaded pulling this together for us. So thanks very much, Jason. And with further ado, I'll have Jason introduce Doug and the rest of the Meridian team.
Perfect. Thank you for coming out today, as Doug said. Now, first of all, planning a seminar between two Dougs gets really confusing. We had Doug M, Doug C. At one point, I didn't know if this Doug was going to present or not. So, no, I wanted to say thank you for coming out. Part of me this morning, when I got up and saw what the temperature was going to be, I thought, should I thank them or apologize for pulling you in out of the beautiful day? But I think what we're doing here today is actually quite valuable, and I think you'll all get quite a bit out of the presentation. It's nice to be back together again. Not looking at a computer screen. It's nice to see faces instead. I know COVID there still technically lingering around, but it's nice just to be able to get together again as a group. And we are lucky enough to have Doug come up and speak to us. Meridian has gone through a ton of changes over the last 30 plus years. A lot of you will remember us as HEPCO. When we were asked to do this 5 years ago, we really felt strongly that we wanted to do something like this because of that connection between HEPCO and where most of you worked for most of your lives. So the fact that we are now Meridian doesn't mean we forgot about HEPCO Credit Union and what it was to begin as the Power Workers Union like that. So we appreciate your support all these years later. On to Doug. I've worked alongside Doug now for 8 years maybe. It's been quite a while, and every time I hear Doug speak, I learn a little bit more, and I really appreciate how he can take a complex topic and make it simple. As Doug said, well, the other Doug said, easy to understand and valuable. So Doug is a tax and estate specialist for Aviso Wealth. Aviso Wealth is a wealth management company that is partnered with all the credit unions across Canada. If you see Q-Trade, Credential, all those different names, that's all owned through Aviso Wealth. Doug is able to support financial advisors like myself from coast to coast, which is pretty great. At one time, he was more Ontario-based, but now he's able to help people from coast to coast. He previously ran an estate planning law practice and was an advanced case consultant with a life insurer and a mutual fund provider. So he's been doing this a long time, and he's had several different roles. He holds a business degree and a master's of law specializing in tax, and is a certified financial planner and a tax and estate specialist. He's been doing this over 25 years now, believe it or not, so he's been doing this for quite a while, and most of his time is supporting financial planners like myself, but he also takes time to write individual articles for newspapers. He does individual case consultations, and of course he does seminars like this today. Without further ado, please welcome Doug Carroll.
Unless I'm on now. Okay, so if it cuts out, you can turn me down if you want. If it cuts out, then I'm going to grab that one. I'm going to work with that one there. And our friend above, by which I mean our AV guy, not, will be switching the slides for me here. The material that you have there in the folder is support material that has some fundamental information about executors and some information about probate, and then an article which is entitled Spousal Rollover or Not. So it's 3 articles. As Jason mentioned, I write a fair bit when I'm not doing this kind of thing, or when I'm having conversations with my advisor colleagues and with clients, then I do a fair bit of writing. So we thought, well, that'll kind of cover off some of the main topics that I'm going to get into here. I'm not going to try to get into technicalities in the session that I'm going through today. Some of that written material covers off that, and I think that that would be far less than exciting, as Doug called it, as he said. I can't imagine people said, hey, he said to your kids, hey kids, we're going out to talk about executors today. It's going to be so exciting, missing out on the sun and then being inside. But I definitely don't want to get into the minutiae of what's involved with estate planning and estate administration. And I am leaning over towards the administration part of things. For those of you who might have skimmed into the materials and took a look at that article, the one that specifically says spousal rollover or not, it's kind of the parallel content to the topic as I have here up on the slides. And it starts with earlier this year, beginning of the year, my dad died. He was 98 and a half, so he was in his 99th year. And as that happened, I was working on some material to do sessions with some of the advisors that I work with, educational sessions with the advisors. And so we thought, well, maybe I'll just use some of the anecdotes that I had come across when I was in practice, as well as things, just cases that I've been exposed to over the course of the years that I've been around working in the financial service industry, but particularly in the legal work that I had done in the past. And then now that my brother and I are working on the estate for my dad, which is a fairly simple estate, my mom's still living, so everything's going over to her, we thought, well, let's bring up some of those anecdotes. So that's essentially what I'm going to do walking through here. And so if we can advance the slides, just take it one forward. The title of the session is a random walk, or the subtitle of the session is a random walk down a state street. And that may not be all that relevant. It might seem like it's something that's coming totally out of left field for you. But for financial advisors, there's a classic book, I don't know when it would have been, like more than 50 years ago, 80 years ago, which is called A Random Walk Down Wall Street. Yeah. And it's the basis for a lot of the knowledge that financial advisors have about what they do and how they interact with clients, and how you can't really predict markets. You would hope that you could just say, yes, put it here and it's always going to go up and it'll never go anywhere else. But it's kind of a random walk that happens. So we just thought, well, let's just call this random walk down a state street as the topic that I'm going through here. So I'm just going to take you through some anecdotes. The only thing that I'm going to have coming up here, there's a little bit of text, but otherwise it's really just pictures, visuals that I've got coming up. So if we can move it over to the next slide, then I'll just take you through the topics that I have here. As much as anything, they're mile markers for me. And I've got 5 topics here that I'm going to go through of series of questions. So preparing yourself for estate planning, so getting into funeral planning particularly, and estate planning, just getting that going in your thought process. Secondly, looking at some of the financial issues that come up when you have an estate that you're managing. And a lot of what I want to bring up here is exceptions to the common type of advice, which is it's critically important that you have that core advice, but some of the exceptions to that advice to be aware of when you and your financial advisor are discussing what is going to happen once someone dies, and particularly in the unfortunate situation where your other half dies and you're the survivor, what decisions that you can make that might be not necessarily the first thought, but that might actually be preferable than going with the standard way of approaching things. Starting with that standard, but then maybe diverging a little bit. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about funerals and the planning that's involved with them directly. The next to last topic, which I'll deal with relatively briefly, I think, is about storytelling and specifically some of the stories that came up in the course of the conversations with my siblings. I'm one of 6, and we were taking care of all of the funeral planning for my dad. And the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about where things go off the rail, where somebody who is named as an executor maybe isn't doing what an executor really should be doing and is acting in their own personal interests rather than doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is acting in the best interests of the estate, and in particular for taking care of the beneficiaries of the estate. So if we could just push it one forward then, and I'll start with this first topic about preparing. And with that, I have this term that my brother had, which he referred to as the Great Death Doc. And what he would do, my brother's 10 years old. I'm the youngest in the family. I got 4 sisters in between. So my brother's the oldest, and every so often, like every 6 months or so, he would send over this document, and at first it was a long explanation, and then it just became, here's the Great Death Doc, could you please set it aside? And basically, it's his instructions of what should happen, and he was married, but he's divorced now, and so I'm the one who then has his Great Death Doc. He sends it to me, I store it up in the cloud, and it's got all sorts of information. I find it really kind of funny. Jason knows me well from the time that we worked directly together when I was working directly for Meridian, and then we've continued to work together here with Aviso. A lot of people say I'm very picky, detailed, organized, etc. I am nothing compared to my brother. He sent this 63-page document that is got things like, okay, the dog's food is raw food. You have to get it from this place on this corner. They're open between 9 and 3 o'clock on Tuesdays only. Like, yeah, I'm driving 60 miles in other directions to go and get your dog's food. I think that we'll be finding out something else, like kibble, that your dog's going to be into after you're gone. Anyhow, he's got this Great Death Doc, as he referred to it. The image that you see there is actually my own bookshelf. And I combined the two concepts or terms of his Great Death Doc and my green binder. And as I said to my wife when she says to me, "You travel a lot. What if something happens to you?" I don't travel quite so much now that we have the pandemic that had happened, and I do a lot of home office stuff these days. But I used to be a frequent flyer, and I'm so happy that I'm not anymore. But you travel a lot. What do? I said, the green binder. Just grab the green binder, pull it out, open it up, and it's the same thing as my brother's 63-page document. It's got all the financial things in different tabs, that type of thing. My general point here is, as much as it might seem like a really heavy exercise to go through, to document everything about yourself, you're the one who knows best about yourself. In fact, you probably don't know as well about yourself as you could if you were to then sit down and prepare a document of this sort. So summarizing the things you have, how you have them, your general wishes. And I'm not talking here about doing your will directly in doing that. I'm talking about putting information down in a place where those who follow after you, including your spouse, who may not know where certain things are located, that you think between you, you know these things, like you can read each other's mind, they may not know about those things. And so getting it down into that document will relieve those who follow in behind you from having to figure out your life when you're no longer there in order to take care of the people who are the survivors of you. So something of that nature is a really important exercise to go through. Every financial institution, every lawyer's office will have some document of that sort, and you really do a big favor to the person or the people who you name as your executors when you've got that as a starting point. out of date in no time, but at least it will be a starting point for them to work from, rather than for them to put their Columbo hat on and try and figure it all out when you're not there to help them out and trying to figure that out. Second item is about wills and wishes, and really my general point, I'm going to come back to this at the very end, but my general point here is everyone should have a will. Sometimes people say, well, when should you have a will? And that's not the right question. It's when you can have a will, have a will. That's not a question, actually. That's a statement. But when you can have a will, you should have a will. Everyone should have a will. Similarly, everyone should have powers of attorney, both for property purposes and for personal care purposes. Everyone should have those in place. You might say, oh, well, but what if I don't have it? And I'm talking about you, because you're retired, you've had a great career, and you do have accumulated wealth, and so you have very good reason, obvious reason to have a will. But your kids, your grandkids might be saying, I don't have anything. Why? I don't have anything, I don't have anyone. What does it matter if I don't have a will? I'll tell you where it matters when you're a young person, you don't have those things, so to speak. My sister died when she was in her 30s, and a death out of order is something that parents really have a hard time managing. That's what it's called, when a child dies before a parent. She did have a will. But just if you don't have a will as a young person, just because you don't have a house or a spouse or kids or whatever it is, you've forgotten the family that you came from and who's going to have to pick up the pieces. Even though the will might be entirely what everyone expects is going to happen, you're giving them guidance of what you have thought through, and you're making it so that it's much more streamlined to be able to carry out the administration of the estate if you have a will in place. Because an intestacy, lack of a will, is just that much more paperwork and headache for parents who then have to figure this out when you're not there. So even worse than when you're figuring it out for your parents, when the parents are figuring it out for a child who's died out of order. So very important to have a will as soon as you can have a will, which is pretty much once you hit the age of majority. So again, that's not a message for you, that's a carry-out message that you can mention to your kids or to your grandkids. Third item here is about a person's name. We have this bizarre thing in our family where we go by our second name. This is my dad's family. We go by our second name. So my first name, my second name is Doug. My first name is Lang, L-A-I-N-G. And that name is actually my mother's maiden name. And it's just because my dad's family, historically, everyone went by their second name, which sounds like an interesting, who knows why, type of tradition, which is a massive headache, because every time I go into any place, I've got to explain why. No, you have to, you don't have to. That's not the name that I go by. Well, it says here, this is what we're going to call you because it says so here. It's like, yeah, but I'm in a hospital and I want to be called and come when you tell me to. If you call out that name, I'm not going to catch it. But apart from that, it's really important that names, however they might be recorded, particularly back in time when things were a little bit more loosey-goosey. As I said, my dad lived for almost a century long, and his name was recorded in a whole bunch of different ways. My brother and I, acting as under the powers of attorney, had consolidated a lot of the assets of my parents, both of whom their capacity had declined significantly over the years. My mom's now 92. She's still living. We'd consolidated a lot of their assets. Well, in the course of doing it, my dad's name appeared in all sorts of different ways, and not only was it because they used his first name, which he didn't go by, rather than his second name, but sometimes they used initials, and so it appeared in all sorts of different ways. We were able to clean that up in the course of gathering together their assets for just taking care of things while we were acting as attorneys, which was much easier than if we had to have done that in the course of administering the estate, which again we're doing now, but it's a pretty simple estate because, as I said, everything and all the different various ways that it can happen are flowing over to my mom. So that's one of the things when you are acting as an attorney for someone, even though you might not feel that you have to make a lot of decisions and do a lot of actions, check the names, check how things are recorded for that person, particularly if you've got someone who's, again, well into their 80s or 90s. It may very well be that the way that their assets were recorded in the past are not consistent. And so getting that consistency will allow for a little bit cleaner administration of an estate later on when it comes about. Funeral pre-planning is something which, for a lot of people, it's just like making a will. Well, if I plan my funeral, I'll die as soon as I sign off on the papers. No, it's not really going to happen, obviously, but that's how a lot of people feel about it. Again, it's one of those things, like with wills, that if you've done that, if you've made the decisions associated with that, if you've thought it through and decided that you really do need to have a titanium box that's going to last for 1,000 years, that's up to you. If you want to, there's actually a way that you can do funerals now, or final remains, where you would think, oh, well, either you get buried or you get cremated. Well, one of the other ways that you can do it is called aquatization, where it's water-based, and essentially, just like with or similarly to cremation, you're liquefied in effect, and it's a much more sensitive way for people to go off into their beyond. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, you're welcome to do that. But just more generally, in terms of pre-planning and funeral planning, it's just nice if you have made the decisions, as opposed to those who are there in the midst of grief having to make those decisions at that time in a very compressed time frame. If you've done the pre-planning ahead of time, then it relieves them of a lot of the stress and a lot of the grief. The last item here on life in pictures is in the course of funerals, and I'm sure that each of us has been to a number of funerals, you see pictures showing up in various places. And this is more of a personal anecdote to things. Again, I've got a number of siblings spread across the country, and I live closest to my parents. My dad had this thing about collecting up pictures. I don't even know how many binders there were of pictures. It was something like 25 or 30 binders of pictures. And to share them with my siblings, I decided, oh, I'll scan them in and I'll put them up in the cloud. 10,000 pictures later, and about 4 years, it was all done. And so that was years ago. This was like 10 years ago. And then when we had the funeral, we didn't need that. My sister and her daughter, they basically picked out about 10 pictures that they thought were the ones that really encapsulated everything, and then they put them on a poster board, and that's what we used at the funeral. So 10 versus 10,000. It was just kind of interesting that I'd gone through that whole process, and then they just took the same ones that had always been sitting on the mantle for years and years and said, "That's Dad, let's just put that up there." Okay? All right, let's just, if you can move me forward one slide, then I'll deal with the next grouping of topics here. And here, I do want to talk about financial issues, financial matters. And again, those of you who have already taken a look at that article will see that these are the same topics that I've touched on there. Generally, between spouses particularly, generally what happens is, unless it's a second marriage or there's some concern about the survivor not being able to manage property or manage money, or you just have scads and scads of money, and so you're going to give it away to all sorts of different places as well as taking care of the survivor. Generally what happens is everything's going to go over to the survivor, and where you have property owned by those people, non-registered, so not inside of RSPs or RIFs or pensions, then that's referred to as non-registered money, open accounts or cash accounts, other way of referring to that. Quite often, spouses will hold their property in joint ownership between the two of them. And the reason why you do that in part is because when a joint owner of property dies, the survivor, or the multiple survivors, because you can have more than two, but between spouses, the survivors continue on in their ownership of that property. And so that's the default that you would expect to happen where you have spouses. However, there may be good reason not to have, well, you want it to transfer over to the survivor, but the default between the spouses is it transfers over at its cost base, so it doesn't trigger any taxes when the first person dies. There is no tax on the disposition. It may be, though, in your situation that you may be content to have the taxes triggered on a first death between spouses. And one of those situations where you might look at that is where someone dies very early in the year, and my dad died about January the 20th. So he had no income really, or minimal income, and therefore it actually would be beneficial to allow for more income to be taxed in his terminal year, which is 20 days long, rather than rolling everything over to mom, which then lumps it all into one place and it's subject to tax later on. So we decided that we were not going to allow all of it to roll over to her at cost base. We in fact caused a fair bit of the joint accounts to be taxed in Dad's estate, and pretty much that was we were able to soak up the otherwise tax that would apply based on his basic personal amount tax credit and his low bracket rates that otherwise would have pushed it all over into mom's hands alone. Similarly, with registered retirement income funds and RRSPs, where you have a spouse as the named beneficiary, those can and often do roll over to the surviving spouse. But it may be that you don't want that to happen for a similar reason, again, using up the low tax rates that would be available on the deceased terminal year. So again, that was something that we did, is we did not roll over the RIF money from mom or from dad to mom and allow it to be rolled over at cost base. We wanted to have the RIF money taxed to dad. Now, in terms of how much RIF money we're talking about, Dad worked for Sears, so big company. He had pension, which continues on. Mom's still going to carry on with that pension. But he continued to work after he'd retired technically from his career, and so he'd built up some RIF money. So it wasn't enormous, but it was reasonable. It was a reasonable amount on top of the pension, and so we were able to then allow for it to be taxed in Dad's hands rather than be taxed over to Mom. Third item about beneficiary designations generally is that they should just be in place. It's one of those things where as you're moving things from place to place, you may miss on putting the beneficiary designations down on investment accounts, on registered accounts of types that you are able to make a beneficiary designation. And so generally those things should be in place. In our case, again, my brother and I had consolidated their assets over the years to get it all into effectively one place so that it wasn't spread all over. And in the course of doing that, there was one account that unfortunately did not have a beneficiary designation on it. It was a TFSA account my dad had. And there's actually one that my mom has in the same institution that doesn't have a beneficiary designation on it right now. But there was the one that my dad had. My brother and I were operating under powers of attorney, and with powers of attorney, the general authority you have as an attorney is that you can do anything for property purposes for the person who grants the power of attorney that they themselves can do with their property, with the exception you can't make a will for that person, and you can't make beneficiary designations or change beneficiary designations of that person. So Dad had gone past the point where his mental capacity was just wasn't there for him to take care of things himself. As we were consolidating those assets and bringing over those that TFSA specifically, we were not able to change the beneficiary designation on that. Effectively, it ended up that it went into Dad's estate. Now, Mom is the 100% beneficiary of Dad's estate, so it went Dad to estate and over to Mom, but it did mean that we did have to go through the probate process to have the will probated and release those funds back over to Mom. That really wasn't a big concern for us because we'd already made the decision. We couldn't get away from it anyway, but we'd already made the decision that we were going to let the RIF money fall into the estate, which did require the probate process to happen. but we're talking about probate levels below the point at which we'd have any significant amount of probate tax. Probate tax is 0.5% of the assets over $50,000 that flow through an estate. And so in this case, through all these things, there was about $100,000 that flowed through Dad's estate, and so we had a very small amount of probate that saved us like $1,000 of probate tax, the Ontario government, that saved us or saved Mom about $20,000 or $30,000 in income tax. So net, we figured that we're in good shape in doing that. The last item here is the late in life, RIF minimums. RIF minimums. One of the things that we were not able to do is that with when you have a RIF minimum, and I do understand that you are all pensioners, as in you have registered pension plans from workplace, but I imagine that many of you also have RIFs. And RIFs do require, based on your age, once you go past age 71, that you have to turn an RSP into a RIF, and that it's mandatory. You have to take a certain percentage out of that from year to year. RIF minimums are taken out when you want during the course of the year, and in Dad's case, the RIF minimum generally was taken out at the beginning of the year, but because he died very early in the year, the meeting with the financial advisor hadn't yet happened, which was my brother's and my meeting with the financial advisor. We hadn't done that. So Dad died before the RIF minimum was taken out. When we came around to reconciling the numbers associated with this, then although we were able to take the bulk of the RIF and to have it taxed at Dad's estate, the RIF minimum would be paying out as part of that process after Dad's death. And the way that the tax rules operate, that RIF minimum then has to be paid out to the estate or to the estate beneficiary. So it ended up being paid out to Mom rather than paid out to Dad, and so the taxes were paid at Mom's rate instead of Dad's rate. So it's just something that if you're going to get really picky and nitpicky about it, then doing the RIF minimum early in the year will make sure that it happens in the first person's estate rather than in the second person's. And hopefully you're not dealing with us on the basis of, I think I'm going to die this year, therefore I'm going to take out my RIF minimum. It's just as a process, taking it out at the beginning of the year assures that it happens in the hands of the person who is a pensioner. The last item here on late in life insurance, as I mentioned, Dad worked for Sears. Any of you who, anybody would know, I think, that Sears unfortunately went belly up, and Dad, being the age that he wasn't really significantly affected by it. He was actually involved in an organization just like this organization, the Sears Retirees Group. He was one of the people who was on the executive for that, which was kind of ironic because his job with Sears, when he retired, he was they've got the vice president of human resources, and he was pretty much the second beneath the vice president of human resources. And here he spent years and years on behalf of the Sears Retirees Group battling with Sears as Sears was basically winding down operation and clearly going to pull up stakes and leave Canada. So Sears eventually did go belly up. I can't remember exactly when it was, sometime in the last decade. They were done with things. And it seriously affected some of the younger retirees. There were people who were just retired or were just about to retire, all of a sudden went from really nice pension to almost zero. And there's been a lot of litigation since then. Didn't affect Dad. The one thing that it did affect is there was life insurance that he had, which you could take over. As you may know, you can take over the insurance yourself if the pension is not going to, or the pension agreement is not going to cover it. And so we did that. He was 92 when that came about, and he could take the insurance if he, without any medical underwriting. So the idea of having a 92-year-old getting life insurance was kind of surprising. And initially my brother said, well, forget that, we're not paying for that. And I said, well, hang on a second, not to jinx Dad, but he's 92. Let's look at what the premium is. It's for Mom's purpose. And we asked Mom, who was actually still reasonably with it at that point, and the premium was about $10,000, and the amount of the insurance was about $80,000. And she says, well, he's not going to live to 100. So we actually got life insurance on a 92-year-old at that time, which did end up paying out, as it turned out. And it goes over to Mom to take care of Mom. And Mom's in fine shape. I mean, she's in a senior's long-term care, but it was her decision to go ahead with it, and off we did. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic then that I have here. And that's, there we go, the funeral itself. Just some things about funerals, and I am not a funeral planner. I don't know deeply about funerals, but just to share some things that happened on the funeral planning. We did have a pre-planned funeral. Again, it was done years ago, and it was actually my parents were instructing. My brother and I were taking care of most of the direct conversation with it. But then Dad died, and so there were still some remaining decisions that had to be made at the time. So one of the things is that funerals or funeral homes, they definitely have caught up with times, and doing a broadcast, an online version of funeral is fairly common now, and that's what we did, which was very helpful because, as it turned out, it was, well, Dad being almost 100 years old, he'd outlived most of the people around him. And those who were still around were not really in great shape to be traveling, so being able to do a broadcast version of the funeral was really very helpful. So we were able to share that out with people, and they were able to attend in that way. Second item here about doing the eulogy. So I'm the youngest in the family, though I'm the lawyer, but I'm the youngest in the family. We're sitting around among us, and as Dad was over the last few months, he was in serious decline. The kids, my siblings and myself, were sitting together, and the question came up, well, who's going to do the eulogy? And they all pointed at me. I was like, what? I know the least because I've been around the least. Why would I do the eulogy? And so we decided that we would just share doing the eulogy, and I'll come back to that when I'm talking about the storytelling. So the eulogy is the spoken part of the ceremony or the funeral itself. But then there's the obituary, which is the written document that perhaps will be used. So here's a little background on my dad. My dad was fairly cheap, as it turns out, and he actually went to work. We lived out in the outer reaches of Scarborough, and he worked downtown Toronto. He went to work with a fellow who lived across the street from us, who was at a similar, they started with Sears at a similar time, they're at a similar level, and they would drive downtown together and drive back at the end of the day. One of the things that they did was they would complain to each other about expensive things like newspaper subscriptions, and they came up with this idea that my dad would get the Globe and Mail, and Don, our neighbor, would get the Toronto Star. And then on Saturdays, Don would bring over this stack of papers and put it on the table, and he would take the stack of the other ones and go in the other direction. It was actually Don's idea. So fine, they managed to reduce down their cost of subscriptions. So here we were, my brother and I, at the funeral home, talking with the funeral director about what remaining decisions had to be made, and he asked us, what about doing obituary? And my brother said, yeah, well, Dad was always a Globe and Mail reader, so I'll draft something up and I'll send it over to you. So my brother sends it over to him, and this very compressed time frame. So this was Monday. The funeral was Wednesday. He sends it over on late on Monday night for the funeral director to look at. We didn't think anything more of it. We did a few other things. So there we were on Wednesday as we're about to get going, and the funeral director leans in at some point and says, okay, I got I got the obituary up with the Globe and Mail. And my brother said, no, that was your draft to take a look at. I didn't want you to put it up right away. He said, oh, it's already done and gone, so we couldn't do anything about it. $1,800 for an obituary on the Globe and Mail's website. It's like all that money that Don and Dad had saved by trading those subscriptions for years and years, we just gave it all back with an $1,800 obituary. So we printed it out and we put it in a frame because we couldn't believe that we'd messed that up. Anyway, that's it. The next item here about referring to the Sunday best is, again, just it's, I don't know if you would say it's interesting, but something that you don't really think about too much. Dad had been in this long-term care place for about 5-6 years, I guess. And of course, his clothes, he just didn't need to have a ton of clothes, and it had gone down to the point where he just had a handful of shirts and shorts, and that was pretty much it. So when he passed away, then there wasn't any property or any clothing. So my brother went out, because my brother is much bigger than my dad, and so my brother goes out and he bought a suit and a pair of shoes to put on Dad that was going to go with Dad going for the funeral, but otherwise he just didn't have any other clothes, and we just didn't think that it would be nice to have him in a house coat, so he had to go in and get him some clothes for that purpose. The last item here about the last mile, again, an interesting thing about funerals. This is here in Ontario. The funeral director asked about pallbearers for the casket, and the way that we figured we would do things is that we would. My house is closest to the funeral home, and so we were going to gather everyone at our house after the funeral at the funeral home. And so when the funeral director asked about pallbearers, we said, no, we're not going to do that. We thought that we could have the burial the following day, and we would have our after the wake party, so to speak, at our place, and we would deal with that the next day. Snowstorm was coming, and the funeral director said, well, we do have to have pallbearers, because the hearse can only take it as far as the roadway. You've got the last, I referred to it on the slide here as the last mile, but it's the last 30 feet from the road over to the burial. So you have to have pallbearers. And he said, don't worry, you guys go ahead and do that. We'll rent some pallbearers. Rent some pallbearers? He said it's $400 each. I have to have 6 of them. It's like $2,400 for these people to go. It's like, I got 3 teenagers, my sister's got a couple, and so we adjusted our plans, and we actually did have our kids. We all took turns as pallbearers. It's not that we don't care about Dad, it's just we were trying to be logical for the people who were going to be there at the funeral and at the wake. But yeah, $2,400 if we hadn't have been paying attention, and we would have got some rental pallbearers to walk the route over to the gravesite. Okay, so I'm going to move that forward to the next one. This is the next group of stories. These are our stories, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, because this is really just personal stories. But this was when we decided we were going to do the eulogy. We thought we'll just share. Each of us who are going to speak would share a story that was representative of our dad. And that would be the eulogy in effect, and so that's what we did. The black eye is actually my dad's own story. He got punched in the face when he was coming home from work one day because he stopped a kid from trying to jump the line and get onto the bus, and so he wrote up this story because he had the big black eye, and he had to show up in business meetings, and his secretary found this picture. That's not him. It's just a picture of this punch-drunk boxer. And it got circulated around his department so that he didn't have to constantly be responding on, why do you have a black eye? So that was, he used to do that all the time. He was in HR. He wrote a lot of the speeches for the president and the chairman and that type of thing. And he just liked writing things out generally. So this was one of the things he did, was these stories. Zorch ball was a recollection of my brother, that my dad and a friend would throw this imaginary ball back and forth that would knock each other over. And my brother, at about 7 years old, was horrified that this Zorch ball was around the house. And that was my dad's response. responsibility on that. The green, green grass at home was what one of my sisters said. Dad used to sing this song to the two of us. We were the two youngest. And he had a really, he was in the choir throughout his life, and he would sing the green, green grass at home. And he would get through it, and then we'd say, do it again, do it again. He'd sing it over again. And it was only later, she said, she actually looked at the words, the green, green grass at home. It's about a guy who's in jail and is being brought back home in a casket to be buried under a tree. But it sounds really nice when you sing the song. And there's Tom Jones doing it. My dad did the same thing, and we thought it was a real cozy song until she saw the words about it. The Sunday hockey thing was my own story about things. My dad was a very religious fellow, and I was in the Scarborough Catholic Hockey League, which had its hockey games on Sunday mornings. He wanted to get to church at the same time as I was doing the hockey, and more than once he would drive me over to the arena across the street from the church, off and go over to church, and I'd be standing there on the side with a stick in my hand and no hockey bag, and he'd be over at church, and so I'd sort of waving across the street, hello, and he'd have to come back and bring the stuff back to me so I could get on the ice and do my hockey practice. White Christmas, I'm just going to hold off on just a second, and I'll bring that back up at the end, and I'll just give this last grouping here. So the last grouping of topics here that I have here are some practical and unfortunate situations about executors who have done things that they shouldn't be doing. When you're acting as an executor, we've included the article in the material that you have there in the folder, which talks about the key responsibilities of acting as an executor. Effectively, you are executing the instructions in the will that the deceased person has put forward. You have what's called a fiduciary responsibility, a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the estate, to guard the assets, to manage them, looking at the needs and the best interests of the estate and the beneficiaries. Unfortunately, some people who get into this role think it's an opportunity to use these assets for their own purposes. And so just a few thoughts on this. I had a client, this is the first one of the items that's showing here. I had a client situation where it was bizarre as it unfolded, but essentially what happened was the client had come to us. She was the executor of the estate of someone, I'll just refer to it as the old country, someone who she didn't really know that well, but came from her village in the old country, and because they had both arrived here in Canada years and years later from the time they'd been back there, he named her as his executor. The problem was he died, and she went to try to take care of things, and the door was locked. The key did not work. What had happened was two young guys, when I say young, they were in their 20s, 30s maybe, two young guys had taken it upon themselves to go in and change the locks on the door. They were either the grandsons or the great-grandsons of some people who were still back in the old country, in the village where they all came from. And these two guys had been instructed to do this and to collect up what was owed from this now deceased fellow, because this guy had not paid his $20 or something for a funeral back in the 1950s. And all the time in between, for about 50 years, this had been tracked, and when he died, then these two were told to go in and get the assets of this person. And there was a big hole in the wall where the safe used to be once we finally got in there, and we had to get a locksmith both to get the door open and to find out for us that there's no more locksmith, or there's no more safe where the assets used to be there. So really bizarre to me that a grudge would be held for 5 decades until they could collect up these assets of this person. These two guys felt that they were doing this in a way that was taking care of their higher generations. And all it earned them was these two guys. One of them was a financial advisor. The other one was a lawyer. And I reported both of them to their respective governing authorities, and they had something to answer for there. So the executor is the one who has the power to deal with the deceased assets, and my client was the executor. Unfortunately, we never did find out what was in that safe, which was never, ever found. So, not the way you're supposed to deal with a deceased person's assets. Second item here about share and share, I call it share and share unlike as opposed to share and share alike. I do a lot of these, and I may have mentioned this in the last session that we did a few years ago, because it was something that happened 25 years ago. No, not quite 25 years ago, and you'll know why it is I say it's not quite 25 years ago. I was doing a session like this, and we do Q&A, and this person started to ask a question. I kind of quickly said, no, stop talking, but the person kept on going. And in front of a whole bunch of other people. Here's basically what it was. This person had been named as the executor for the neighbor's estate and had started administering the estate, did not want to involve lawyer because lawyers are expensive. And so had started administering the estate, but it was more complicated to do. And so it was set aside. I don't want to use even male or female references here. So it was set aside for almost a year. And there really wasn't much involved in the estate except some shares, and that was the point at which it came out what these shares were. What shares do you think might have been at issue back in about the year 1999 or 2000 when this would have happened? Nortel shares. The person who died had been an employee who had a lot of shares through low cost, purchase of the shares, died when Nortel had peaked, and then the bottom dropped out of it. By the time we were having this seminar, those shares were worth less than the tax liability on the shares when the person had died. Now, you might say, oh, well, this person's in big trouble as the executor. The problem is there was one beneficiary of the estate. It was a 5-year-old kid. So this person who had the responsibility to take care of this estate of their neighbor had decided that it's too expensive to involve a lawyer to try and do it himself, and then made an absolute mess out of the whole thing. So that was, again, saying, stop talking, but we got the whole story coming out in the course of doing this because this person was all stressed about it, and that wasn't the worst of it because obviously the kid was going to bear the brunt of it. They just weren't worth anything at that point, and so there wasn't much to pass on in the estate other than the house itself, as it turned out. Third opportunity here is about the opportunistic executor. This is also a situation where I'd had some connection with it. It's more of a story that I would usually relate. On this one occasion, it was kind of interesting how I got an extra part to it. Have any of you heard of Agnico Eagle Mines? It's a company started mainly by this one fellow who did not have any kids, and he had all these business partners who he worked with over the years that followed. And he made out his will naming one of his key executives, all C-suite people, named one of his fellows as his executor. His wife had, by that time, had early onset dementia of some sort, I believe, and was in long-term care. The beneficiaries of the estate, other than his wife, were then a number of charities. This guy dies, and the person who was named as the executor proceeded to live in the house in Rosedale in Toronto, renew the Leafs and the Raptors tickets, hang out at the Muskoka Mansion, whatever that thing was, and this went on for almost 10 years, I think, this occurred. And eventually, the charities who were further in behind, the charities eventually brought forward an action, and the fellow was put in jail for a couple of years because he would not report for what he had done over the course of that time. So really bad, bad actions by this person. I related this story one day in North Toronto, and afterwards this couple came up to me and said, "You missed the part about where he showed up in Honolulu." I said, I don't know the part about this Honolulu because that wasn't in the reported case. And he said, "We were chatting with our next door neighbor who'd been living there for about 10 years about us going off to Hawaii in the next week. And lo and behold, he showed up there in Hawaii, came walking down the street." These guys were the next door neighbors of this guy, of the original people, and then this guy who had moved into the house. They had no idea what he had done. They thought that he just bought the house and that he was the new owner. It never came up until the point where they saw this reported case themselves. So not the way that you're supposed to act as an executor. You have legal authority to manage the property of the deceased person, but you don't have the beneficial rights unless you are a beneficiary under the will. But otherwise, with your hat on as executor, you have the legal rights to manage things, but you do it for the benefit of the beneficiaries of the estate. The last two things here about DIY estates and DIY wills, do-it-yourself estates and wills. I'm actually okay with the idea of people with eyes wide open, potentially doing it themselves, preferably with some original or some starting guidance from a lawyer or a lawyer's office, a law clerk, as to the steps that are necessary to carry out the instructions in a will to act as an executor. Because when you're doing the administration of the estate, unless there's a disabled beneficiary or a minor child, like the situation that I referred to there, generally the job of acting as an executor is following instructions that have already been laid out for you. And as long as you're doing that conscientiously, then doing it yourself is not such a terrible thing to be doing. You may or may not save costs. You might miss some things, but it's probably not going to be fatal if you make some small errors. Again, get some instruction in the first place, and preferably you will use a lawyer's office or one of the services. There's some online services that will guide you now, or a trust company if it's a larger estate. But do-it-yourself wills, as much as definitely they've come a long way from the $1.99 things that you get at the stationery stores to the online way that it can be done now, I still get really nervous about the do-it-yourself wills. To me, the process of estate planning, going through the thought process yourself of who am I, what do I have, who are the important people around me, how do I want to take care of them, that's a really important thought process and active engagement that's necessary to make sure that you lay things out appropriately for those who are going to follow in behind you. And the reason why I have this image, the last image here over on the far right side, of a doctor, is that very much I think that it is a matter of laying out the information about yourself and saying, what is the appropriate things that I might consider doing here? I'll decide what to do, but I need to have something that's going to give me more of a prescription on how I achieve what I'm trying to do, as opposed to the more clerical kind of activity for a DIY estate. So do-it-yourself wills, yes, you can do it yourself. Yes, there are some much better services that are available to do those things. But you have to be careful that what you think is everything about your estate planning being the will, it's one critically important part of doing your estate planning, but it is not the equivalency of estate planning. So make sure that you have the opportunity, you avail yourself of the opportunity to get information, to get guidance from a professional who can help you understand what the possibilities are which is going to very much include the will, but it may not be entirely the will that takes care of things. There might be other ways to do things where you don't want things to go through a will. So if you want to advance me one more slide here, there's one thing that is not included in the material that you have there. Oh, actually, I've got two more slides. Yeah, go one more, please, and just hang on for a second. Yeah, just go one further forward. Yeah, and one forward. Yeah, okay. I said that I held off on the comment that I was going to make about the Santa Claus suit there, and it was it was something that my sister on the when the group of us were sitting together and talking about stories about my dad. This is my oldest sister, who is kind of like our second mom. She's 9 years older than me, and she took care of things when Mom wasn't around at times. And she traveled a fair bit. When my dad retired, she came back for the retirement. She'd been in Europe, and she came back. My dad wasn't expecting that she would be there. She came back for the party for his retirement. And he had this group of people in his department who were very devoted to him. And while we were, when we were there at the event for his retirement, the group, as somebody was relating their devotion to my dad, they started singing this song. Everyone knows the movie White Christmas, and it starts off and it ends later on with this song, which is called "The Old Man." It goes, "We'll follow the old man wherever he goes," etc., etc., if you know White Christmas. And my dad's department all got up and sang this song because this is the way they felt about my dad, and quite a number of them, and this is 35 years later, quite a number of them showed up at his funeral, at the funeral that happened back in January. It was just a really touching thing that my sister saw about my dad's relationship with the people he worked with. And then when she related that story, my dad's secretary, for most of the time that he was working there, she was there at the funeral, and she said, yeah, she remembered that. And she remembered typing up that story about the black eye as well, that she sourced that info. Okay, last item that I'll throw this at you, and then we'll wrap it here. We have a number of things that we've included in the material, just the articles in the folder there. There's one item, you won't be able to read this, but there's one item that we'll share with you after we're finished here. Doug can share it out with everybody, perhaps by email. It's a document which we call an estate pre-planning worksheet. And what it does is it allows you to write down. It's got some guidance on it. It's not an inventory of the things you have, which is commonly what financial advisors, financial institutions would provide to you, so that you can record the things you have and the important connections you have. And lawyers' offices would have something of that nature leading into making out a will. What this is it's prior to that. It's more of a think piece of who, what, when, where, why, if, how. Who are the important people around me? What are the things that I have? When do I want to transfer on my assets? Where are those things located, or those people located? How do I want to transfer them on to them? Do I want to do it through my will? Do I want to just hand it over directly? What are the tax implications? It gives you an opportunity to think through those things. So that document then, we'll give that to Doug, and Doug can share that out with the group, which is something that you can sit together as a couple, if you are a couple, or on your own, or if you've got a financial advisor you work with, you can sit with them and maybe just work through some of these things. The idea is it gives you a chance to think through the issues, the things that relate to you, so that when you sit down with a lawyer to do your will and do your broader estate planning, that you've got as much ready, top of mind as you can about yourself, because you're the expert in you, so that you can make best use of the expertise that you're accessing by speaking to the professional that you're dealing with. So it's got some technical points that are suggested, but otherwise it's just for you to get down some notes, say, okay, I'm ready to have that otherwise sometimes intimidating conversation with the lawyer in the lawyer's office. you'll be ready to go with as much as possible at the tips of your fingers about the info about you to then have that conversation. Okay, that's everything that I've got, and I know we're just off the half hour now. I can hang around to have more of a conversation, but I know that I had a chat with a few people who do need to get rolling, so I don't want to hold you here. Anybody who wants to do some questions, we can do that, but I just want to make sure that we stop so that those who need to get going can do so. So, Doug, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you want to take it from there. Oh.
Okay. So I guess on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank Doug. He's taken a sort of a difficult topic, and with the antidote, with the stories that he's shared with us, personal stories, it sort of makes it an easier topic to understand. So that was certainly very helpful. I also want to thank Meridian for again putting this on for us. That's great. I think it's a topic that we all probably should look at every 4 or 5 years as things change in our own lives. Our state planning goals may change somewhat too. So it is a living document, and I encourage everybody to look at that every few years. So aside from that, assuming there are no questions, I'll.
We do have a door prize too, though.
Oh, okay.
I'll be quick because I know we're over time. Obviously, we're very appreciative to be invited back, so thank you very much. If anyone ever has any questions from these sessions, don't be afraid to give us a call. Aaron, Andy, and Bobby, they're all here from Meridian along with myself. Easy, if you can open up your pamphlets you got today or your folders. There's a little slip of paper on the right-hand side for feedback. By all means, if you have a few minutes, leave us some feedback, whether you thought it was valuable and if you'd like to contact us. And then on the left side of your folder, there should be my handsome face, and then Doug is behind that. And then one person in the audience should have a lucky turkey. On the left side, my name is Bob. Lucky turkey wins the door prize then.
Thanks very much, Jason. Appreciate that. That was a bonus we didn't expect. On your way out, if you wouldn't mind, we want to leave the church as we found it when we arrived here. So there are recycling bins there for your bottles of water. If you can just throw them in there if you're finished with them, or if you're still drinking water, take it with you. But other than that, thanks very much, and I hope you had a good day.